بعديك نحل حوايج وأدخل في الماء البارد. بعديك هزون التعليق عالقول على الفوقية فوق وصوابع 24 ساعة على الصوابع. بعديك قعدت في شهر وبعد هزون الماء تغطس على برميل معبى بالماء وزي يغطس فيه بالماء من الماء. بعد الماء هزوا الغرفة بتاع نحول لكم عامل كوش نحول كل حوايج على البنسول كل تاع ولا صار. بعد كده قاعدين فيه بالعصير أنا معلق أضرب في العصير بالعصا. بعدك دي قية أنا ظهري مقشور بالبيب اللي وعيوني قبل ساعات قديش تشبه خليل تشبه العين طبعا ورجلي قديش نمشي بهم المسافة كبيرة قديش نمشي ولي تو حيرة ولا ساعات تبكي مخمم ومفكر بس شو الحل بتاعي شو المستقبل بتاعه مع شيء ونوع عمل شيء 3 سنة ولا شيء يعمل فيها كذا.
1965 and 1966, the Indonesian military intentionally killed approximately 1 million innocent civilians with the active, enthusiastic participation of the United States government. They still are finding bones in the sand, just feet away from where people are posing for Instagram bikini shots.
Welcome back to the Iceberg. Today we're on Tier 2. We've got 5 theories mixed in with this one, and I'll let you know when we get to them. It's important to remember, though, that just because they're theories doesn't mean it's not true. A lot of these verifiable facts we know on here, we only know because of leaks or whistleblowers or the CIA making a mistake. So just because the CIA hasn't been caught red-handed or admitted to it yet doesn't mean it's necessarily not true. But I encourage you to look them up and decide for yourself. So first on our list is the Iraqi National Congress. So the CIA funded an organization called the Iraqi National Congress. And by funding this organization, they were trying to unite 2 Kurdish groups with other organizations in northern Iraq under an umbrella. And by financing their operations, they reasoned they could provide a public forum for stirring up popular opposition to Saddam Hussein. This was all quite a few years before the invasion of Iraq and was a precursor to more blatant attempts by the CIA and the State Department to oust Saddam Hussein. The CIA often does this kind of thing, where they fund a group of dissidents in a targeted country in order to destabilize the country and legitimize actions that the US wants to take. So next we have Solidarity Trade Union. The Solidarity Trade Union was an independent trade union in Poland given $2 million every year by the CIA, as well as equipment and training in the trade union's efforts of civil resistance to the communist government in Poland. So the CIA is incredibly opportunistic and was funding a workers' organization to put pressure on Poland. It's interesting to note, though, that once Poland transitioned to capitalism, Solidarity's membership declined 90%. The CIA Tibetan program was a nearly 2 decades long anti-Chinese covert operation focused on Tibet, which consisted of political action, propaganda, paramilitary, and intelligence operations. Essentially, this is very similar to the Iraqi National Congress we talked about just now. They again are funding a group in a targeted country, this time being China, in order to foment more tension and conflict, in order to clamp down China's influence in the region. The Dalai Lama himself was officially on the CIA payroll from the 50s to 1974. Now, if you think this one isn't that bad because you happen to think China is authoritarian or funding resistance to them is good, imagine if the countries were flipped. Like, imagine if China was funding a dissident group in the US for the explicit purpose of creating conflict. It's really an insidious practice and harmful to peace and stability everywhere. Nicaraguan cocaine trafficking. So I talked about this one in the first episode. It is alleged by many journalists that the U.S. was funding drug smuggling in their Contra operations out of Nicaragua. There's a lot of controversy, but given the CIA's track record, it's hard not to believe it happened. At the very least, a former CIA analyst said this, quote, "Once you set up a covert operation to supply arms and money, it's very difficult to separate it from the kind of people who are involved in other forms of trade, and especially drugs. There is a limited number of planes, pilots, and landing strips, so by developing a system for supply of the Contras, the U.S. built a road for drug supply into the U.S. 5 American Contra supporters who worked with the rebels confirmed the charges, noting that, quote, 2 Cuban Americans used armed rebel groups to guard cocaine at clandestine airfields in northern Costa Rica. They identified the Cuban Americans as members of Brigade 2506, which was an anti-Castro group that participated in the 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion. So right there is a clear connection to the CIA. Several also said they supplied information about the smuggling to U.S. investigators. One of the Americans said, quote, "That is an ongoing operation. The cocaine is unloaded from planes at rebel airstrips and taken to an Atlantic coast port area, where it is concealed on shrimp boats and are later unloaded in the Miami area." So everyone knows about MKUltra, so I'm going to tell you some things about the program that you probably don't know. MKUltra was the illegal torture program by the CIA to figure out how to subdue and control the human mind. It has been referred to as a continuation of the work begun in World War II era Japanese facilities and Nazi concentration camps. So side note here, I've actually had a personal theory in my head that apparently has already been made before by Alfred McCoy, which is that the CIA tried to get the media to focus on ridiculous programs like MKUltra to distract from the more concrete, horrible projects the CIA has done over the years. Let me explain to you how disgusting these MKUltra experiments were, though. They targeted mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and prostitutes, or in other words, people who could not fight back. They would dope these people unknowingly with drugs in order to find a way to bring out deep confessions or wipe a subject's mind clean. Pretty much they took people against their will and tried to break their minds. They experimented with barbiturates and amphetamines, putting barbiturates in someone until they passed out and then waking them up by putting amphetamines in them. They experimented with heroin, morphine, temazepam, mescaline, psilocybin, scopolamine, whatever that is, alcohol, and sodium pentothal. And so MKUltra was really not about mind control, even though that's what we all think about. It was more so about finding a bulletproof way to extract information, or in other words, torture. The only reason we know about this project is that there was a failure in destroying all of the documents, and instead 20,000 documents were incorrectly stored in financial records. It's like I was saying earlier, this would be a complete wacko theory if not for the fact that the CIA fucked up and put some documents in financial records instead. Operation Mongoose was an extensive campaign of terrorist attacks against civilians in Cuba with the intended purpose of getting the Cuban people to overthrow their government. These terror attacks included torturing and murdering students who were teaching farmers to read and write, blowing up shoppers at Havana's busiest department stores, bombing sugarcane plantations and tobacco fields, killing Cuban fishermen, biological attacks including an outbreak of swine fever that killed 500,000 of Cuba's pigs. And perhaps the worst case was the 1981 epidemic of dengue fever. This part is a theory, but you'll see why it's pretty much verified to me. But totally unheard of in Cuba prior to this period, dengue fever. More than 300,000 people were affected within a 6-month period, and estimated 102 children died as a result of the disease. Cuban-American Eduardo Aracena testified in 1984 that he traveled to Cuba in 1980 to, quote, introduce some germs into the country to, quote, start a chemical war, as reported by the New York Times. CIA agent Posada Carriles is infamously known for his alleged masterminding of the bombing of Cubana Airlines Flight 455 in October of 1976, killing all 73 people on board. The incident remains the second worst act of air terrorism in the Americas, only exceeded by 9/11. Evidence prior Evidence points to the involvement of Posada Carriles and fellow Cuban Orlando Bosch with organizing the crime based on extensive U.S. documentation. So we get this idea of who's involved from the U.S. investigating. So they know the guys who did this plane bombing, and those dudes were totally free to live in the U.S. freely. And the U.S. has the audacity to put Cuba on its list of states that sponsor terrorism. Gary Webb's suicide. So we get to our first real theory in the iceberg. This is not verifiable fact, so I'll let you know every time I get to a theory rather than a fact. So Gary Webb's suicide is referring to the mysterious death of a journalist named Gary Webb. Webb published an article series titled Dark Alliance, which investigated the Contra CIA drug running connections that we talked about earlier. In 2004, he was found dead with 2 gunshot wounds to his head, and his death was ruled a suicide. Usually doesn't happen. Now this theory states that the CIA was responsible for his suicide, but the coroner had concluded that it was indeed a suicide, with the first shot going through his face and his second shot hitting an artery and killing him. I mean, it's definitely strange. You usually don't shoot yourself in the face. And I'm sure at the very least there were some people at the CIA who didn't hate the situation, no matter if it was self-inflicted or not. But rest in peace, Gary Webb. Arrest of Nelson Mandela. This one is short. The CIA tipped off the South African government, which led to the arrest and 27-year imprisonment of Nelson Mandela for his activities resisting white minority rule in South Africa. So everyone knows he was in prison for a long time, and the CIA put him there. JFK assassination. So the JFK assassination CIA connection is another theory, but I mean, dude, this one is pretty believable if you ask me. I really don't think I should get into it though, because there are so many books and articles and other YouTube videos going into the whole situation. It would take me an hour just to scratch the surface of this one because it's so deep. I really recommend you look into it though, because there's a ton of evidence out there. Check out the podcast TrueAnon series on the JFK assassination for a total deep dive. Or this Wendigoon video I'm going to put a tiny little clip in and put a link for, if you want just a normal dude explaining to you how the CIA did it.
That government groups don't want us to know about. I'm trying to get past the minute monetization time before I say the specific word, but yeah, we'll get there. I hope that you all can appreciate real art when you see it. We give the official retelling of events. On November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy... Has it been past a minute? It's probably been past a minute. The CIA killed John F. Kennedy. Like, hilariously so, but we'll get to that.
Advanced knowledge of 9/11. So this is another theory. This is like the JFK assassination, where I don't have the time or knowledge to get into all of the technicalities of the theory. But I would recommend the TrueAnon podcast series again on 9/11 if you're interested in learning more. The French Connection. So the French Connection was a scheme through which heroin was smuggled from Indochina through Turkey to France and then to the United States and Canada. And this was responsible for providing the vast majority of the heroin used in the United States at the time. What this has to do with the CIA is that the Corsican gang, which ran the heroin labs in France, was actually protected by the CIA in exchange for working to prevent French communists from bringing the old port of Marseille under their control. This is just another example of the CIA helping organized crime and making it safe for drugs to go all over the world. Operation Mockingbird was a large-scale program of the CIA's to manipulate news media for their own propaganda purposes. Leading American journalists were recruited into the propaganda network to report what the CIA wanted to be reported.
At CBS, we had been contacted by the CIA. As a matter of fact, by the time I became the head of the whole news and public affairs operation in 1954, ships had been established, and I was told about them and asked if I'd carry on with them.
We have quite a lot of detailed information, and we will evaluate it, and we will include any evidence of wrongdoing or any evidence of impropriety in our final report and make recommendations.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI?
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
Senator, do you think that you named the news organizations in your final report?
That remains to be decided.
I think it was entirely in order for our correspondents at that time to make use of CIA agent chiefs of station and other members of the executive staff of CIA as sources of information which were useful in their assessments of world conditions.
Would you say that continues today?
Well, I would think probably for a reporter it would continue today, but because of all of the revelations of the period of the 1970s, it seems to me that a reporter's got to be much more circumspect in doing it now, or he runs the risk of at least being looked at with considerable disfavor by the public. I think you've got to be much more careful about it.
On all press, nobody go out and look for themselves and whatever else. Tom Brokaw said, well, they were burned, the military was burned in Vietnam, and now they're being cautious, and you can't blame them. I thought that was kind of a remarkable statement to make for a pressman to say, I don't mind the government censorship. I'll take whatever handouts they give me, whatever they say about the war and how it's going, what it's about and all that, that's what I will simply write. And so you have what some people have called the stenographers for power, that the media becomes the guys who write whatever the State Department says ABC, it's ABC. The next day the line changes to XYZ, then it's XYZ.
The 1953 Iranian coup d'etat was the overthrow of the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in favor of strengthening the monarchical rule of the Shah on 19th of August 1953, which was orchestrated by the United States and the CIA. In August of 2013, the U.S. government formally acknowledged the U.S. role in the coup by releasing a bulk of previously classified government documents that show it was in charge of both the planning and the execution of the coup, including the bribing of Iranian politicians, security, and army high-ranking officials, as well as pro-coup propaganda. The CIA is quoted acknowledging the coup was carried out, quote, under CIA direction and, quote, as an act of U.S. foreign policy conceived and approved at the highest level of government. The CIA again is overthrowing another democratically elected government. Mossadegh had begun to nationalize Iranian oil, and the CIA saw that as an unacceptable example to the rest of the Middle East and decided to overthrow him and put in a dictatorship instead. AFGHANI opioid trafficking. So this is another theory. The AFGHANI opioid trafficking CIA connection is a theory that the CIA and the U.S. government are involved in trafficking heroin and opium out of Afghanistan following their invasion in 2001. The U.S. just recently exited Afghanistan, but occupying it for 20 years, the opium trade has skyrocketed. It is estimated that over 90% of the heroin in the world originates in Afghanistan. In 2007, Afghanistan had more land-growing drugs than Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia combined. In 2002, former Additional Secretary in the Cabinet Secretariat of the Government of India wrote that, in regard to the failure to combat the rise in opium production, quote, this marked lack of success in the heroin front is due to the fact that the CIA of the USA, which encouraged these heroin barons during the Afghan War of the 1980s in order to spread heroin addiction amongst the Soviet troops, is now using them in its search for bin Laden and other surviving leaders of the Al-Qaeda. The Hindu reported in 2008 that 90% of the heroin sold in Russia comes from Afghanistan, and Putin himself was quoted as saying, unfortunately, NATO is doing nothing to reduce the narcotic threat from Afghanistan even a tiny bit, and that the coalition forces were, quote, sitting back and watching caravans haul drugs across Afghanistan to the former Soviet Union and Europe. The article then reported that, quote, according to unconfirmed reports, the U.S. military transport aviation is used for the delivery of drugs from Afghanistan to the American air bases, and that it has been reported earlier that the CIA is involved in Afghanistan's opium production, or at least producing it, at least protecting it. One Russian journalist quoted anonymous Afghan official as saying 85% of all drugs produced in southern and southeastern provinces are shipped abroad to by U.S. aviation. So again, nothing has been admitted by the CIA here. A lot of officials in other countries believe that this is happening though. And with their track record with drug running isn't really out of the ordinary. 1954 Guatemalan coup. So the 1954 Guatemalan coup d'etat, codenamed Operation PB Success, was a covert operation carried out by the US CIA that deposed the democratically elected Guatemalan president Arbenz and ended the Guatemalan Revolution of 1944 to 1954. It installed the military dictatorship of Carlos Castillo Armas, and the first in a series of US-backed authoritarian rulers in Guatemala. So the Guatemalan Revolution began in 1944 after a popular uprising toppled the military dictatorship of Jorge Ubico. Arbenz's government introduced a minimum wage and near universal suffrage and turned Guatemala into a democracy. Arbenz instituted land reforms, which granted property to landless peasants. After Arbenz was elected, he formally legalized the Communist Guatemalan Party of Labor, and the United Fruit Company, whose highly profitable business had been affected by the end of exploitative labor practices in Guatemala, engaged in an influential lobbying campaign to persuade the US to overthrow the Guatemalan government. And so yeah, if you're a fruit company and you're mad at a company, you can just ask the US to... I'm mad at a country, you can ask the US to overthrow them. I guess it's that fucking stupid. So after the CIA orchestrated the coup, Armas quickly assumed dictatorial powers, banning opposition parties, imprisoning and torturing political opponents, and reversing the social reforms of the revolution. Project Merrimac and Resistance. So Project Merrimac was a domestic espionage operation coordinated under the CIA and involved information gathering procedures via infiltration and surveillance of Washington-based anti-war groups that might pose potential threats to the CIA. However, the type of data gathered also included general information on the infrastructure of targeted communities. I'm pretty sure the CIA is not supposed to do stuff domestically, like it's part of their own bylaws, but yeah, they were spying on anti-war groups. Golden Triangle heroin trafficking. So this one is again a theory. During the Vietnam War, the CIA's surrogate there was a Laotian general, Vang Pao, who commanded Military Region 2 in northern Laos. He enlisted 30,000 tribesmen into the service of the CIA, and these tribesmen continued to grow as they had for generations the opium poppy. Before long, someone had established a heroin drug refinery lab in Region 2, and the lab's production was soon being ferried out on the planes of the CIA's front airline, Air America. Actually, a pair of BNDD, which was the precursor to the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, actually tried to seize an Air America plane during this time. Further documentation of CIA-connected Laotian opium trade is provided by Rolling Stone magazine in 1968 and by Alfred McCoy in 1972. Alfred stated that, quote, "In most cases, the CIA's role involved various forms of complicity, tolerance, or studied ignorance about the trade, not any direct culpability in the actual trafficking. The CIA did not handle heroin, but it did provide its drug lord allies with transport, arms, and political protection. In sum, the CIA's role in the Southeast Asian heroin trade involved indirect complicity rather than direct culpability." So again, this one is a theory that they were doing it to profit from it, but either way, they were protecting the dudes who were running drugs and using Air America planes. 1973 Chilean coup. So the CIA feared a successful socialist experiment in Latin America and immediately worked to undermine and overthrow it. And this is the time when Richard Nixon famously said he was going to make the Chilean economy scream. So the 1973 Chilean coup d'etat was a military coup in Chile that deposed the popular unity government of President Salvador Allende. After an extended period of social unrest and political tension between the opposition-controlled Congress and the socialist president, as well as the economic war ordered by U.S. President Richard Nixon. So a group of military officers led by General Augusto Pinochet seized power in a coup, ending civilian rule. The military established a junta that suspended all political activity in Chile and repressed left-wing movements. And so the Nixon administration and the CIA, which had worked to create the conditions for the coup by making the economy scream and stuff like that, promptly recognized the government, the new coup government, and supported it in consolidating power. During the air raid and ground attacks that preceded the coup, Allende gave his final speech vowing to stay in the presidential palace and was refusing offers of safe passage should he choose exile over confrontation. Before the coup, Chile had been hailed as a beacon of democracy and political stability for decades, a period in which the rest of South America had been plagued by military juntas and other dictatorships. The collapse of Chilean democracy ended a succession of democratic governments in Chile, which had held democratic elections since 1932.
Tengo fe en Chile su destino. Superará otros hombres este momento gris y amargo donde la traición pretende imponer. Sigan ustedes sabiendo que mucho más temprano que tarde, de nuevo, abrirán las grandes alamedas por donde pase el hombre libre para construir una sociedad mejor. ¡Viva Chile! ¡Viva el pueblo! ¡Vivan los trabajadores! Estas fueron mis últimas palabras. Tengo la certeza de que mi sacrificio no será en vano. Tengo la certeza de que por lo menos será una lección moral que castigará la felonía, la cobardía y la traición.
Pronouncing this one, but Ngo Diem Dinh assassination. So Dinh was South Vietnam's dictator that the CIA and the US used as a bulwark against the communist insurgents during the Vietnam War. But when he frustrated the CIA, they had him executed in a coup and replaced. Kind of savage to execute your own allies, but that's what the CIA did. BCCI. So the BCCI scandal was surrounding the BCCI Bank due to its involvement in massive money laundering and other financial crimes. The CIA used the BCCI Bank, and it is alleged that they used it for covert operations, secret deals, and even unauthorized off-the-shelf dirty trick schemes, which could be perpetrated without repercussions. The CIA actually did admit that it was aware of the bank's involvement with criminal activities and that it used the bank to move money around the world, but the agency has insisted that its own involvement with the bank was entirely legal. I mean, you can decide if you believe them or not. Alright, so that's the end of Tier 2. Like I was telling you, there were 5 theories in this one. If I made a mistake, let me know. If you have any questions, let me know. And thank you for watching.